Hello everyone, welcome to the Artefacto YouTube channel. My name is Jessica Bryant. To create a great watercolor painting, it's important to carefully plan. You want to choose a reference that allows you to craft a high quality composition. Please watch the full video and you might find it helpful to take some notes or watch it again.
So I'm going to start at the top edge here. I'm going to tilt my brush up. These are some nice small shapes that we have happening in the skies. They're going to be pretty easy to control with the edge of this brush and not have our paint dry out before we finish the shape. Okay, in that case I went right to the edge. If I'm a little worried about how cleanly I can handle where these two shapes are going to meet up, I can, oops, I need to pull more pigment here. I can pull this shape down into the next shape a little bit. And if I make some value shapes with what's on my brush that mimic the kinds of shapes that I see happening in this, I could even do a little bit more here, areas that I see a little bit darker. That blue will largely disappear into these shapes and it will feel like it fits because I made shapes that match. So it gave me a way to not have to try to make a perfect clear edge. All right, so we're going to keep going to the next blue area. This is about the same value. So I'm going to continue with what I had on my brush already. And I'm just working slowly with the edge of my brush. If you'd prefer to be with a round brush or something different, you're welcome to do that. This is just my personal preference for painting here. And I'm noticing as I come across it, this gets lighter. The sky that shows through there gets a little bit lighter. So I'm going to add some water. Make sure that I'm getting a little bit lighter as I come across. End up in there, another here. Just hitting all of these blue shapes. And you can turn your paper, whatever you need to do to make it feel easier to see what you're painting. If it's easier to work upside down, you can do that. That one looks a little bit darker, so I'm going to pull to the side and pull a little bit of my darker pigment. Oop, too dark. Too dark. I'm just going to draw out my brush and pull some of that pigment right back off. Okay, so I have some shapes happening down here. And I just want to comment again that when you watch someone who's been painting for a long time, the speed and the style of shapes they make might not be matching where you're at. You don't need to mimic the shape or the speed and the style of brush use that you watch somebody else have. Take your time, paint the way you need to paint to make sure that you have the control you want to have with what you're doing. It's very okay to slow down and paint with intention. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, while I'm here, those shapes are so isolated, I could come in with some of these darker values. So I think I'm done with my sky color, maybe even for the whole painting. Blend some of that into here and see where I'm at. I think I like that. All right. So that's too dark though, so I want to make sure I add some more water in here. Try to get the value I want. Again, you can keep checking, keep going. If this is not comfortable yet, if mixing color and value is not comfortable, test it out before you lay it down. And again, I'm just looking at the main shapes that I see happening here. Now I'm going to dry my brush clean and dry my brush out. And while this is wet, I'm going to set some water at the edges to soften them and let them blend into the surrounding lighter values. And I'm going to pull out where that value got a little bit darker over there. And I'm going to keep doing that. Look for areas where we see these darker value shapes. You could draw these out. If you don't feel very confident doing this freehand, by all means, draw out the location of every value shape you want to. Now, I know in this image that my clouds are overly light. They don't really look this light. So I'm going to go ahead and make up a few darker values to break up the space of these very bright areas of white paper, because I know that's not what it would feel like if I were standing there in person. So I'm thinking about the shapes of these clouds, what I had already happening. When I'm taking my reference photos, I like to take a few different exposures. If you're somebody who knows enough about photography and enjoys it, that's a familiar term. That's something you can think about, is taking a few different images with different exposures. So in some, maybe the sky is a little easier to see what's happening. In others, maybe the rest of the subject is easier. Depending on what your usual subject is, it may not be landscapes. You might find different tricks that work well for you to ensure that your reference images give you what you need for information when you go to paint. Okay, now as that's drying, I feel like I could go just a touch darker through part of here, maybe part of there. Again, I'd like to soften that in to what's around it. It's very soft, gradual value changes here in these clouds. Nothing too abrupt. Okay, my pencil lines I can probably erase later, so I will stop right here. This looks pretty good. Okay, moving right along. Number 2, we said we were going to do these foreground areas. So let's see what we see happening in there. It's pretty light, we had decided. So let's just look at color. We've got, if I had to look at the background, the lightest lights through here and decide what color that is. Remember, these can help you out. I'm seeing a gray, maybe a slightly purplish gray. And down in here, it looks a little warmer to me, maybe a little more orangey pink, something like that. So gray, I'm pretty comfortable making my gray with these 2 pigments to start with. And this is pretty light, so I can be really pretty light here. Just compare right up next to it. I think that's pretty close. That looks really close to the right value already. And the color even looks pretty close. Now I have areas that feel a little more purple and areas that feel a little more orangish down through here. So let's mix some of both of those. I already have them started here. That's kind of a little more red than anything I see in here. So I'm going to bring in some more blue. And that's stronger than I see, but if I mix a touch of that with my gray, it might give me some nice variation. And let's see this warmth. This looks really, really strong. Again, this is a very light value here, so we want a lot of water. And if we're not sure what's happening with the colors, sometimes these light, warm or cool grays can be really tough to mix. Make yourself a little swatch and hold it up next to it. Is it too red, too yellow, or too blue? I think this looks a little bit too red. So I might try adding a little bit of my other 2 primaries and see what happens.
Follow the link in the description and register for free. I really want everyone to succeed in painting. I hope my lessons will help you do that. Watercolor can be challenging. It requires thinking differently than in other painting mediums. Taking the time to plan your painting before you start can make the painting process feel easier and more enjoyable, and it really offers a chance to avoid some of the common struggles.
Okay, so trying to do this quickly. If this is my warmer mix here, I want to hit the areas that feel warmer to me. And I just want to fill them in. Everything that looks this warmer, kind of almost a peach tone. I want to fill that whole shape in. Now, this might start to feel like it's looking a little too light because we're surrounded by white. So if you're really not sure, hold up a viewfinder to those values and see where you're at. We could even almost go darker here. I'm not going to, because I know I'm going to put some texture and that will give us a sense of it being a little darker overall. So I'm going to keep going with what I have here. And I don't even need to worry about where my darks are right now. I could just paint all of this in. Everything in this whole area that has a light area, a light value that matches this kind of color. I'll go around some of my greens. Honestly, this is so light, I could go right over even the greenery that I see in some places here, the plants, because they're darker value and they're fairly gray. So I could just go right over, fill this whole thing in like this if I want to. And I'd made this other purple. Whoa, too purple. I could put hints of this in some places to get some value variation if I want, or some color variation if I want. Let's say I'm trying to do this as a really pretty quick, let's speed up in fact. Let's try to do this one as a pretty quick example. Okay. Oh, I'm going to get this little area too because this is lighter. It's not quite that same value, but it's close to that color. So I'm going to fill that in. There's a little spot here too. I'm going to look around real quick for anything else that feels like it could be this value, this color. See a little bit in here maybe. That's pretty good. And really we're losing the warmth back here. So I don't want to use that same mix. I might go back over to this purple I had and mix in some gray. Oh, that's funny, I had this gray and I didn't even end up using that. And I'll put this in these areas over here where I can see the same subject, the same rock, and it's light. It's not super light. Okay, so then I have all of that blocked in. That's looking pretty good. Okay, it's going the right direction for my taste. Okay, I think we're getting to a place where we could call this a finished painting or a finished study of this scene. We're pretty good. A couple things I'm not thrilled with. I don't like the way these are, the space is broken up there. It looks too stripy. So I'm going to see if I can't make this, break the stripes, the vertical stripes up with some horizontal unifying paint application. So kind of pulling this across so these shapes become one at the bottom of this area. And then as they come upwards, maybe they can split off and get separated vertically again. Maybe also need to break up the sense of this. These lighter areas through here is looking too much like just one value in there. That might have gone a little too far. Time to mix a new puddle. I'm working too hard to get paint off my palette. Okay. And right through here, I don't like how this feels isolated from the forest where the rock sticks out here. Felt like there's a line coming across. There was a line coming across. I don't like that. So I'm going to work that shape in as best I can. That might go too far. And remember I talked about too that I might want to get a little bit darker in some of these, so now might be my opportunity to do that. If I want to bring the sense of some of these areas as being a little bit closer. This would be a good time. Something like that. A little too well defined. I'm just going to blend some out so that this is not too cookie cutter, too predictable, too much the same all through that area. I want some good variation. Okay, and then I think I'd like a little stronger green through some of these. It's pretty good. And I think we can call this about done. Now I'm going to leave the masking fluid on for now. I'm going to show you that, taking that off a little bit later. But so let's say this is my subject matter that I'm choosing. I have it here in both black and white and color. And the reason I have that is most of us have a pretty hard time identifying the value in color. We can tell relative whether something is darker or lighter pretty well. Most of the time we can look at two neighboring colors and figure out which is lighter, which is darker, but not always. There are some colors that will give us a sense of being lighter or darker than another, even if the value is the same between those colors. And it's just because we don't get taught to pay attention to value. When we're young, we learn to identify color, we learn to identify shapes, we learn to identify all sorts of things. Value is not one of them. It doesn't really serve a purpose in very many parts of the world, or parts of our lives, except as artists, it's a huge component. So I like to make a black and white version just to illustrate this is something you can do for yourself. If you're struggling to see the color or see the value in the color of your subject, make a black and white copy. And that can make it a little bit more easy to see the main value structure. And the reason that value structure matters is that's kind of the essence of your painting. Color gets a lot of the glory. A lot of people are very excited and care very much about color. I'm one of them. But the color is not as important as that value structure. The value structure really drives the mood and the feeling of a painting, very much drives the compositional balance. And it is, you know, our eyes perceive value as well as color. And our brains really are using that black and white structure to tell us what the subject is. That's why black and white photographs look realistic too. I could talk on any of these subjects all day long, but keeping us moving forward, what we're looking at here is complex, has a lot of different values. If we think about value as an endless spectrum from white to black, we can divide that spectrum as many times as we want to. So we could make a value chart. This one has 9 different values on it, white, black, and then 7 other values in the middle. So I have 3 light, 3 medium, 3 dark values. I could also make a chart that has 20 values or 5 values or 3 values. And any of those is just a simplification of what we're looking at, because this has, you know, infinite values. There's some areas where we're getting a transition from light to dark, and it's a very gradual, very smooth transition where you can't tell distinctly where that value changed. It's just gradual. And then there's areas where it's a very crisp, sharp edge that has that change. The crisp, sharp edges are generally easier to deal with. Watercolor gives us the really nice advantage of that fluidity of the water. We can use that to do those more gentle value transitions. However, if you are looking at some of those value transitions, sometimes you have a light to dark gradual that takes this much space. Sometimes it maybe takes this much space. Sometimes maybe it's all the way across the page, like a sky, dark to light. The space that those value transitions take up is really important, and that comes back to observation. So when we're looking at our subject matter, it's really easy to look at detail. We're trained to do that, right? We go outside and we can notice every little leaf on a tree. We can notice every rock in a stream. Painting that is overwhelming. Hardly ever are we actually going to want to paint every leaf on a tree and every rock in a stream. I would argue that you never want to do that because that's not really the way we perceive the world, and so it'll feel artificial. So then how do you decide, right? How do you figure out what to include, what not to include? I think the first key to this is understanding the most basic structure of what you're looking at. And the most basic way we can look at the value structure of an image of a subject is to think in terms of just black and just white. So if I'm looking at this image, let's make it smaller for us. Actually, I'll go a little larger for you so you can see what I'm doing here. So if we look at this, if we had to choose every area on here, whether it's black or white, what you're going to do is squint. And if a shape looks closer to black, we're going to make it black. If it looks closer to white, we're going to make it white. And we're going to try to keep our shapes fairly large. So we could do this and start making some really tiny shapes in some of these rocks. But if you put this image across the room, looked at it from, you know, all the way across the room away, you're not going to see all of that detail. So that's why I suggest squinting. It kind of mimics looking at it from across the room, or go ahead and put the image across the room if that's easier to do. And let's just look at what really stands out. So as far as dark versus light, I see the shape of this dip back here. And this is, and I will talk about things less in terms of what the subject matter is and more in terms of shape, because it does not matter if something is a tree or a rock or a cloud. What matters is what is the shape and is it dark or light? And if we start, when we start labeling things, then our brain starts giving us more information that we think we know about it. Like, oh, mountains are big, so that should be big. It might not be big. It might be very small. So the more you can teach yourself to think in terms of the abstract shape and not the subject matter, the easier it can be to learn to observe more accurately what it is you're looking at. So I've got the top of my image, bottom of my image, halfway is about here. It looks like this shape is just slightly above halfway. And it comes kind of straight across most of the way. It's not very tall. It's kind of a angle arrow shape. So there's that shape. Now I see another large kind of triangle shape over here. It looks like it comes to pretty close to the middle of the page, actually. And it comes over a ways and it kind of drops down and it angles up. Well, the angle changes right about in here, something like that. And this is another dark shape. Again, I'm looking at just dark versus light. Now, I'm trying to keep this pretty simple. So I'm looking at what really grabs me overall. And yes, there's some different light, dark shapes in here. There's not one right answer to this stuff. You could start to get into the fact that some of this, the top edge of this is a little staggered. That does not matter to the overall structure so much. And maybe I'd choose to make that all a little bit darker. Comes over a little further. That's not a substantial change to what this shape looks like. So that's not actually, those little things I just added are not important. They're important if we start thinking about subject matter. And this might have made some of you happy because all of a sudden it started to look like what it was a little bit because I gave you an impression of some trees. But you want to be really careful with that. That is not an essential component of what's happening in our reference here. So as far as dark shapes, I also see a dark shape that kind of comes like this. And I see, again, I'm having to choose just light or dark. And if I'm choosing just light or dark, this kind of middle gray, I have to choose whether I think that looks more white or more dark. And different days, honestly, I will choose that differently. There's not just one right answer to any of this. This is a pretty dark shape. There's a dark. And I think I would say this is actually dark. If I have to choose dark versus light, this is a lot darker. And that's darker. So hopefully you can see that structure there. That's, again, this is just very simple dark versus light. Now, another way I could simplify this is, again, that triangle shape here, triangle shape here. And I could have had much of this shape just become dark. And that's not necessarily inaccurate. It's making different choices about where something leans light versus where something leans dark. Hopefully you can kind of see how both work and convey. The main structure is really similar between the two. This is the main structure of this image. Compositionally, this is the abstract structure that's happening here. And as you might notice, it's a pretty decent one. We've got a large dark shape here. This is our big dominant dark shape. It's balanced out on the other opposite side with another dark shape. We've got a long dark shape here. We've got smaller ones here. There is some balance and some movement. There isn't one side that's all dark and the other side all light. There's no division. This works pretty well where we have things happening around, keeping the eye moving through the entire piece. So compositionally, this is a great way to figure out if your reference is actually interesting or not. If this is not interesting, if you make a black and white small sketch of your image and it's not compelling to look at, it might not be something that you want to paint. If that structure doesn't hold together small, it probably won't hold together large either. So the point of this is, one, it gives you practice experimenting and observing and representing the shapes that you see. It gives your brain a chance to really think and focus on what is happening in this. What are my shapes? What are my values? How is this relating to each other? And this is the main structure that needs to show in my final painting. Whether my final painting is a 30-minute quick, loose painting or a 3-day long, big, epic, carefully detailed painting, however you handle it, this is the main structure that you want to be there if this is the image you're wanting to paint and you want it to feel the way it feels here. This value structure is key to conveying the sense of the mood and the feeling of this. Now, there's nuances, of course. All the small value changes are going to have an impact. This is very bold. This is a little bit more soft in places. Some of the things will change, but this is the main essence that you're after. So from there, I like to suggest, what if I gave you 3 values? How would you see this if I gave you dark, light, and medium? So if we're going to do this again, and now I have different choices to make, I have to pick whether a shape is black, white, or gray. So I'm pretty sure that I'm going to start with this same shape, also black, because that is one of the darkest darker darks in my image. I am pretty sure that most things that the way I handled this particular sketch, I did only put the darkest darks as black. I didn't really move too many of the grays into that. So largely it's going to start out looking pretty similar. It won't stay there, but it will start out there. And this is not exact. This is just getting us in the ballpark. Let's see. A little shadow here. And this starts getting a lot more complex. So let's come back to that. One way you can handle that, if you look at this and you start seeing all the detail, it starts to feel complicated. How do I tell if it's gray versus black? Again, squint. And the lightest lights are pretty easy to make out. The darkest darks are pretty easy to make out. You're going to need to make a choice of where your gray is, and then between gray and black, you're going to have to choose. Every value that's darker than middle will be either gray or black, and you have to choose whether it seems closer to the gray or closer to the black. And then between gray and white, light versus medium value, you're going to have to make a choice with every value in that range, whether it's more close to white or whether it's more close to the gray. So for instance, if I come up into the clouds, I could choose that these little dark shadows here are actually so much closer to the white that those stay just as a white shape. I'm going to choose to not do that because I also want to see how that structure holds up in my image. And looking at the overall structure in this particular one, I want to be able to have a little bit of a sense of what's going to happen with some of these shapes in the sky and, excuse me, some of the shapes in the water. So I might lean some of these light grays towards that middle value so that I can see them. So I can, if we want, we can wait on what feels hard. And I'm just saying that could be what feels hard. It might not be what feels hard to you. And we could start by saying, here's my middle gray, and I could say my sky shape is middle gray up to there. Now, we're only doing 3 values, so we're doing no blending, no gradient, no blending, just white, black, or gray is all you get here. I will say that this is going to be my gray. I'm going to try to make it the same gray that I used in my sky. And you can do exercises like this. If you're not a big fan of drawing with pencil, you can buy markers in white, black, and gray. And if you really enjoy markers, this might be a really fun way to get to use markers when you're drawing or sketching. So I have a lot of my blacks and grays represented. And I do see a shape here in the water where this is all gray, but maybe it'll be parts of that might end up darker. And I could say, if I'm really not sure how I want to handle this, I could make it gray to start with because I know everything in here is at least middle value. And if I'm having trouble seeing, I could start just right there and say, okay, that's all, at least that's middle value. Now, if I squint, what do I see? If I look at my reference, my lights are very light, my darks are very dark, my grays are this in between. This whole shape really leans far closer to dark than it does towards gray. So even though when I look at this with my eyes open, I can see all sorts of detail and start thinking that maybe I want gray versus black both happening in this shape, as soon as I squint, that all disappears except for this little shape right in here. So I could have this little shape stay light, and then really everything else around it is still going to be in my darkest dark value. So that should still look mostly like what I did up here. Okay, this one I had given us some more of the detail in the shape here. Again, really, really non-essential, not really a key part of what's happening. If it makes you happy, you can do it, but be careful. If you start pulling in detail when you're doing the main structure, you might be in trouble. You might be starting to see not the wrong things, but putting your attention onto things that aren't what you're wanting to do at this stage. The reason I like this, I mentioned this already, several things. One, it gives you the chance to understand and practice the basic structure of your subject. And understanding that will help you recognize whether or not you're representing that all the way through the painting process. You want this structure to show up in your final painting if this subject is something that you like as it is. If you're wanting to change the values in here, that's another story, and it's well worth practicing those, which you can also do in studies like this, or you can pull in 10 values. You don't have to just do 2 or 3 values. You can do whatever you'd like to do, whatever helps you, whatever makes this work easier for you. Do that. There's no one right way for any of this. A lot of the students that I get are so used to looking at all of the detail, all of the nuance, all of the things all at once, and it's overwhelming. And it's so easy to lose track of the main structure that is anchoring everything else. And that's this. If you painted this as a black and white, it's already starting to look like what the subject is. And then, anything else we add on to it is just choices of how much we're going to add on to it. Those are the style choices that you have. And some of that is going to be based just on who you are and your personal preferences, and you won't be able to help it. And that's as it should be. So observation really is learning to see what you're actually looking at, not what you think you're looking at. And that is so much harder than it sounds like for most of us. Most of us are really used to how we see culturally, which is to make quick assessments about things, to exaggerate the differences of things that we see, because it serves us very well in everyday life. It's part of how we tell each other apart, even though our faces all look almost the same. If you do a lot of portrait painting and drawing, you'll learn that the things that make our faces look different from each other's are just these tiny, tiny
little measurements of difference in the placement of the corner of an eye or the width of a nose. They're very, very small. We all look almost the same, and yet we can tell each other apart very easily because we're used to exaggerating those differences that we see. But if you do that here, when looking at your subject and you're trying to paint it, depending on what you're looking to get out of your finished painting, that can be very frustrating, and it can be very much not what you want. It might be exactly what you want, but you probably wouldn't be in this workshop if that was what you were wanting to do. So if you're wanting your things to feel like the subject that you chose, really is about learning to observe what's actually there. And of course, your drawing skill is part of it too. If you don't have strong drawing skills and you just want to paint for fun, it's absolutely okay to trace things or transfer them in some way. You don't have to work on drawing skill to be a painter for the fun of it. Which, like, that's I could get on a soapbox about that, which I'm not going to do. So this is our main observation. And then when we go to translate, this is the start of it. So translation, what I mean by that is we observe something and then we have choice about what we do with that on our paper. How are we going to translate what we're observing? And that can be any number of things. That's everything, right? That's the personal style. If you go to an art museum and look at all the different ways that people have painted trees throughout history, that's all different ways to translate an observation of a particular subject. And there's not a right or wrong in any of that. There's something that makes you happy or something that makes you unhappy. But this is still the first step, being able to see what you're actually looking at and represent it the way you're seeing it look. Now, from here, any amount of detail I add, so if we came back into this, or maybe I should do that bigger. So I did a 2 value, I did a 3 value. If I gave you 5 values, you would have white, black, medium gray, a light gray, and a dark gray. That would make this look pretty different, wouldn't it? So from there, if we had those choices, this might still be a darkest dark. I would probably still have, I'm going really fast here, so the accuracy is not phenomenal. These are still my darkest darks. And you could also help yourself out if this idea of focusing on value is fairly new or a struggle. Make yourself a value chart, even for just your study. So if I'm going to do 5 values, I'm going to say there's white. With this particular pencil, this is the darkest I can get. So this is going to represent my black. And then if I were halfway in between, let's say maybe it would look like that. And if I go halfway between these two, maybe it'll be something closer to that. And halfway between these might be something like that. And so if I was going to do 5 values, here's my 5 value chart, which means these are the only 5 values I should see in my little study here that I'm going to do. So I have my darkest darks. See some darkest things here. Maybe I get some of those shapes coming through. And darkest dark, I see a shape here. Keep in mind, one thing you could do for yourself when you're trying to observe these to make it a little more easily to think this way, because this might be really challenging, take a pencil, make an extra copy in black and white, take a pencil and outline the shapes you see. So you could say, here's my lightest light. It looks like.
I hope this video is helpful for you. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel where we assist all individuals in mastering the skills of painting and immersing themselves in the wonderful world of art. Don't forget to follow the link in the video description and register for my course. See you there soon.